It's an honor and privilege that we have Dr. Paul Clayton, a pioneer and global leader in the field of pharmaconutrition and the mind behind our groundbreaking products at Zenxino. Today, our focus lies on exploring the main reasons why traditional medicine is falling short in meeting the healthcare needs of our children, and discuss proactive steps that can be taken to bridge the gap between traditional practices and pediatric health. We are witnessing an alarming rise in cognitive and behavioral issues like ADHD, ADD, skin conditions, allergies, and compromised immune systems. Today, we'll explore natural approaches that parents can embrace to support and enhance their children's well-being. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Dr. Paul. I'm going to hand over to you, and we can ask questions at the end.
Okay, well, thank you, Shivani. That's I'll try and live up to your introduction. You know, I'm not going to show any slides today. In my business, you can get PowerPointed to death, and I'd rather just have a conversation with you all, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
And I think that perhaps before we start talking about, solutions to the problems, what are the problems? Just how bad is the situation for our kids? And I think that when you step back from the details, you mentioned the neurodevelopmental disorders, and we all know there's issues with kids on the spectrum, but that's just a very small part of a very bleak picture. So I think what I'd like to do is just really more from memory than from anything else, just go through some of the healthcare problems that are disfiguring the pediatric landscape right now. And I think should strike a note of, if not fear, at least anxiety into the heart of every parent or would-be parent, because it's pretty obvious that we're bringing up our kids in an environment that is damaging them very, very extensively. And that is a relatively new set of problems. We didn't have to experience anything quite as negative as this. And of course, I'm probably twice as old as anybody else in the room, and it was certainly not the case in the period after the war. So I was born in 1950, and it was a time of rationing, and we certainly didn't have any ultra-processed foods. Actually, there was a lot of foods, basic foods, that we didn't have access to. I don't think I saw an orange until I was about 7 or 8. They simply weren't in the shops. And the food that I remember eating as a child, and I cross-reference this with my brother, we ate a lot of porridge, a lot of oats, and the one other food we could get we could get quite easily, and we ate a lot of, was herrings. Kippers was they were always on the menu. Now you have to remember, I'm from north of the border, and I'm not sure that was the case throughout England. Game, because my father was a hunter, and root crops, potatoes and turnips and stuff like that, and berries in season. So it was really a very old-fashioned kind of diet. And in the school that I went to, which was in one of those educational factories, a big school of about 2,000 kids, all boys, because we had, segregation, sexual segregation in those days. I think there was one boy who had a weight problem, who I remember. And there was one boy who had asthma. There were no kids with spectrum-related issues at all. These are all very, very modern problems. They've become such a part of the landscape that we've almost come to think of them as normal. They're not. These are relatively recent changes that have happened, negative changes. And you can trace all of this to the diet and lifestyle, but particularly the diet, that our children now have to survive. If you look through the general picture of health trends for adults, it's extremely negative. We're seeing increases in the frequency of all the chronic degenerative diseases, almost without exception, and a decrease in latency. So we see more of them. We see them affecting younger and younger people, and we see more and more of them emerging amongst children. However, that bad the situation might be now, and we know that the frequency of many of these problems in children is actually very high, all the trends are indicating to us that they're going to get worse if we don't slam on the brakes and do something about it. And slamming on the brakes is not going to be a question of going to the medical community and asking for more pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are not the answer. the problems are not caused by a lack of pharmaceuticals, and they're certainly not solved by them, because the pharmaceuticals that we use to treat these conditions are toxic. I won't try and be polite about it. We kill a lot of our patients. A lot of people die of iatrogenic disease. And I don't think it's a good idea medicalizing people in general, and certainly not children. So let's consider what some of these trends are and how directly they've affected kids. Over the last 30 years or so, so you can go back to the 1990s, 1980s, that's really when the step change starts to happen. Chronic health conditions in young patients have hugely increased. They've got to the point now where 1 in 3 children has a chronic condition of one sort or another. And as I said, when I was growing up, we just didn't see children with these conditions at all. 1 child in 20, it's about 5% now, have got 2 or more chronic conditions. And, you know, the children are like canaries in the coal mine. In many ways, they're more sensitive to many of the environmental issues than adults are. And they're showing us that something is really very seriously wrong. Now, ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, all of those, the neurodevelopmental conditions that you yourself referred to, all of those are increasing very dramatically. But we can add to that asthma. Asthma is very, very common now. I think many classrooms will have, you know, up 3 or 4 kids bringing inhalers to school. In the school that I went to, 2,000 kids, 1 child would get very slight asthma attacks. Eczema is another condition sort of related to asthma in some ways that has increased very dramatically. It's hard to get hard and fast figures on the frequency of eczema, because mild cases of eczema generally are not reported. But I've heard figures of between 10 and 15%. I don't know how robust they are, but that somewhat reflects, you know, my own personal experience. You may have your own views on this. Hypertension, well, we've always thought of that as a disease of middle and old age, now affects between 5 and 7% of all children, and 10 to 12% of children who are obese. And of course, their numbers are increasing. In fact, obesity is off the scale now. If you look at photographs of classrooms full of kids in the 60s or 50s, I mean, we were all skinny. There wasn't anybody, or hardly anybody at all, with an overweight problem. As I said, 1 child who had a moderate weight problem in the school that I went to. Now, in the UK and in the United States, between the ages of 2 and 19, and I'm not quite sure if you're 19, you're not really still a child, but that's how they break the age ranges down. Between 2 and 19, it's about 20%, 1 in 5 who are clinically obese, and another 2 at least who are overweight. So the numbers of kids who are normal weight, healthy weight, are actually now in a minority. And then partly as a result of this, when you're overweight and obese, the risk of a lot of pathologies starts to increase. And diabetes is one of those. Since 2000 or thereabouts, 2001 or 2002, I'm not quite sure when the last survey was done, the numbers of children with type 2 diabetes have increased by about 50% from memory. And oddly enough, the numbers of children with type 1 diabetes have also increased by about half that much, by about 25%. And we can come back to that as to the reasons for that, although we think a lot of that is probably due to dysbiosis, which again is a dietary phenomenon. If we're talking about diet and allergy, which is, I think, a topic that's also really important to a lot of parents, because there are so many children with allergies now. In 2013 or 2013, I think, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States reported that between 1995 and 2015, I think over a period of 14 or 50 years, the numbers of children reporting a food allergy, number of parents reporting that their child had a food allergy, increased by 50%. So that's another sign that something is going very, very wrong here. Now, I did mention that some of that is related to dysbiosis. Well, that is a situation that happens when you move to the ultra-processed diet, which is becoming more and more important. One of the factors that is deficient in the ultra-processed diet, and there are many, is a considerable lack of what we call prebiotic fibers. And these are fibers that are not fuel for you, they're for the probiotic bacteria that live in the intestines. And what happens is if they're taken away from the diet, and we have to think of these as essential nutrients now, they're clearly absolutely critical for your long-term health. You cannot make them in the body, you have to get them from the diet. So they're just like vitamins in that respect. They've basically been removed. And if that happens, the good bugs, the probiotic bacteria, die back because there's no fuel for them to run on. Their place is taken by gram-negative bacteria, which aren't necessarily very good for you at all. We know that they're coated in a substance that causes huge chronic inflammatory stress in the gut, and that damages the epithelial barrier function. Now, normally the walls of the gut are designed to keep everything out except for very small digested molecules, which you can deal with. They get into the bloodstream and you use them. But when the epithelial barrier has been degraded, as it is by chronic inflammation, now you start seeing macromolecules, really big molecules, getting across the gut wall into the portal circulation, into the liver, and getting into the systemic circulation. And some of these macromolecules, which are not supposed to be there, you will then go on to develop an allergy to. And this is considered to be one of the reasons why we're seeing so much more allergy, food allergy in particular. The problem may be being exacerbated by emulsifiers, which are being included in so many of the ultra-processed foods as well. Ultimately, emulsifiers also damage the gut barrier. And because we're eating far less anti-inflammatory compounds, the inflammation caused by the dysbiosis is that much worse. So here is a group of factors that when you take them together, really look as if they explain the increase in this type of problem very neatly. Now, I mentioned that children are getting heavier. We now have probably 10% who are obese, another 20% who are overweight. Once you start moving in that direction, you move towards metabolic syndrome. So that explains why we're seeing so many more children who have hypertension, high blood pressure. It also explains why we're seeing more and more children who are developing metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. And it also begins to explain why we're having such a problem with liver disease in children. And this is another condition that until recently we have only seen in adults. So this is another example of that broader trend that I told you about. We're seeing more people with liver disease, such as fatty liver disease, which now affects an astonishing 1 in 4 of the world's entire population. That's how unhealthy our lifestyle is. But we're now seeing much more of this in children. So let's take the obese children who are approximately responsible now for between what numbers of children who are obese again, probably 20%, and I'm being generous now, and then add another 40% who are overweight. So these people already have a weight problem, they have a metabolic problem. In fact, they're so metabolically skewed, 2/3 of the obese children, that along with diabetes and hypertension, they also have NAFLD, which is non-alcohol related fatty liver disease. Around 2000, there was a big study which looked for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in children, and they found it in 10% of all children. So you can double or treble that in overweight and obese children. And in this group of 10% of all children who had NAFLD, almost, well, between 1/3 and 1/2 had progressed to NASH. Now, NASH is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is a much more severe condition affecting the liver, where you're now starting to see not just chronic inflammation and fatty infiltration, but scarring as well. So you're moving towards cirrhosis. And that, if it's allowed to continue, you're going to get permanent liver damage, and you're now going to see a hugely increased risk of hepatocellular carcinoma and a couple of other really nasty liver cancers as well. Again, we would never expect to see these in children, but they're now starting to appear. Now, a lot of the conditions that I've talked about clearly involve chronic inflammatory stress, whether it's in the skin, or neuroinflammation in the brain relating to the spectrum diseases, or whether it's NAFLD and NASH. And that's clearly very closely related to our ultra-processed diet, which has gone from being very anti-inflammatory, which was the diet that I grew up on, to being very pro-inflammatory. So our children are really very vulnerable because of that. But I'll talk about the liver first, because although chronic inflammation is one of those factors that drives non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and NASH and the liver cancers, there's other things going on in the liver as well. And I'm just focusing on this at the moment because it's so alarming to see this disease in children and because it's becoming such a public health issue. So chronic inflammatory stress is one. A diet that has got a far too high content of sugars and carbohydrates is another. That drives something that we call intrahepatic lipogenesis. If you're eating lots and lots of sugar, you start producing fats inside the liver itself. If you have dysbiosis, which the modern diet also creates, you have something called endotoxemia. You're getting really nasty inflammatory molecules leaving the gut, entering the portal circulation. And of course, where do they go first? The liver. And this is another factor that's driving liver disease. And finally, inactivity. We know now that if you take lots of exercise, it triggers something called autophagy, which is a process of cellular housekeeping, renewal, and repairs in the liver and in many other tissues besides. And so if you have chronic inflammatory stress and dysbiosis and a diet full of carbs, you're going to have liver disease. And if you're also inactive, and it's quite likely that if you're really overweight, you're not going to be taking that much physical exercise, you're doomed. You're almost certainly going to end up with NAFLD, NASH, and the even more serious conditions that will follow on from that. I've introduced on the unfortunate topic of cancer, but it isn't just the liver that's affected. Just this year, we've seen a huge study coming out of Harvard looking at the wide range of all the most important cancers and what they have recorded in the last decade or so, a very short period of time. No, I think we have to go back a bit forward, a bit further back for the whole figures. Within the last generation, we've seen a doubling of cancers in teens and young adults. But what the Harvard group looked at, they looked at increases decade over decade of early onset cancers. Now, early onset, when you're speaking to a cancer specialist, means under the age of 50. It's pretty unusual to have cancer under the age of 50. Most cancers happen as you get older than that. But what they actually did was they looked at cancers of the breast, the colorectum, the endometrium, the esophagus, the liver, head and neck, kidney, bone marrow, pancreas, prostate, stomach, thyroid. Those would be all the top ones, I think. And all of them are increasing. They're increasing decade on decade. And here's the point. Because they're increasing in young subjects, in people who are under the age of 50, and it takes a long time for cancer to develop and to become clinically important, this is telling us that children are being exposed to a carcinogenic exposome, the exposome being their diet, their environment, their lifestyle, and everything else. Probably, I would say, from the point of birth, and perhaps from even before birth. That's how desperately serious this situation is. I want to talk about one of two other things that have increased over the last few decades. And you mentioned the spectrum disorders, and I sort of picked up on that. But there's a lot of other problems involving the central nervous system, which have also increased, and where we think that chronic inflammatory stress involving different parts of the brain, which we call neuroinflammation, experienced at an early age in utero, and perhaps in the few years after birth, we have good reason to believe is involved. Schizophrenia is one. Schizophrenia trend, that's trending up. And we're seeing a lot of that, more of that in young patients, probably due to the same reasons for increased spectrum problems. We're seeing, although I will admit that this is not that well documented, but it looks as if we're seeing increasing numbers of children with borderline personality disorder. And for those of you who've lived with that, lived with a partner who has that, or a child with that, it's extraordinarily difficult and painful to manage. And many of these people will end up committing suicide in over the long run. Hikikomori, which those of you who know the work that I do probably heard me talk about before, and that's a condition that was first identified in Japan, characterized as an inability to indulge in or become involved in social interaction. So this is a generation of kids who've retreated from the world, who are unable really to form social relationships or become involved meaningfully in the workforce in any shape or form. They live in their parents' basements or attics. Their exposure to the world is through social media, and that is about it. first identified in Japan, subsequently found in many other countries. Gender dysphoria is, of course, a very, very hot topic at the moment. And if you look through my blog, you'll find that we are seeing increases in testosterone level in young girls for various reasons. We're seeing testosterone levels falling in men. Now, I don't want to be crudely reduction about this and say that this is the only reason for the number of kids with gender dysphoria, but it's clearly contributing to it. Trauma-induced brain damage is increasing, and that's not something that children are going to be terribly involved in, but for those of them that get involved in contact sports, that has actually become a source of real concern. It's very clear now that for those who do get involved in contact sports have a higher risk of developing ARCD, age-related cognitive decline, and dementia in later life. Their brains are not being protected in the way that ours were a generation or 2 generations ago. Epilepsy is increasing, eating disorders are increasing. And then if we move from conditions involving the central nervous system, as I've mentioned, chronic pain in children, that's increasing, chronic illness in general, female infertility, and alopecia. We're seeing more children developing hair loss at increasingly early ages. All of these things should be telling you there's something seriously wrong with the environment that we are raising our children in, and we really need to do something about this. And if that doesn't motivate you, then even more alarmingly, what we're seeing now is pretty good evidence of declining intelligence. And we're seeing that through different types of measurements. We're seeing that through visual judgment and reaction times, but we're also seeing a reduced intelligence as measured by three-dimensional mental rotation, complex sentence construction and comprehension, and fine color discrimination. These are all different ways of measuring IQ, and they're all trending downwards. Along with that, we're seeing reduced impulse control. And that's very much related to neuroinflammation, which is directly related to diet and lifestyle, reduced resilience. So children are giving up more easily. They're not as well able to cope with difficulty and to surmount it. Instead, they are more likely to retreat and concede failure and become depressed and anxious. And of course, depression and anxiety in children are skyrocketing. And motivation. Motivation, it also seems to be very closely linked to resilience. And we know which parts of the brain are involved in determining how resilient and how motivated your child is. And these parts of the brain are being adversely affected by, as I said, the exposome. That is what they eat, how much physical activity they have, other interactions that they might have with the wider world. So the picture is profoundly negative. I think that if you're not alarmed by this litany of problems that we're seeing increasingly in children, then you haven't understood it. If you're concerned about your children and you want them to do as well as you did or better, we have to find ways of creating a more productive and less damaging environment for them to grow up into. And as far as I'm concerned, that starts preconceptually. What happens in utero, particularly during the second and third trimesters, is really, really important. And I haven't even talked about epigenetic programming, whereby, you know, the sins of the mothers and possibly the grandmothers and fathers are expressed in the health problems of the next generation and possibly the generation after that. So we're in trouble. We're in free fall. There's not a single idiot politician out there who's taken cognizance of this, let alone decided to do something about it. We are being cumulatively and chronically poisoned by the food industry. If you look at a breakdown of infant foods in particular, they're disgraceful. I mean, they've been condemned by doctors, nutritionists, and dentists who are very worried about the high content of sugars because they have to deal with things like dental decay. The food companies say, oh, we're doing better, but they don't. They're lying through their teeth. And they will continue to do so as long as we continue to buy their toxic products, or unless pressure is brought on them, to bear on them to stop selling these products to us and to our children. Drugs are not the answer. The only answer is to alleviate these toxins, prevent our children from being affected by them in the first place. So that's the picture. We can go on to talk about what we can do about it if you want, but I thought maybe I'd just pause there and give you a chance to ask a few questions.
I think after hearing that, everybody wants to know, what do we do?
Well, I don't want to give the impression that the answer is to take supplements. That's only a part of the solution. I think that it makes more sense, to me at any rate, to make a decision that we're not going to buy very many or perhaps any of these ultra processed foods. We're not going to use them to reward children's good behavior so that they associate, for example, confectionery items with good behavior. That's terrible conditioning, really bad programming. I think the best thing we can do, and I know this is hard, especially for people who are time poor, or who don't have access to a farmer's market, or who don't have the spending power. But it's really important for the sake of our children to leave those ultra processed food products behind, however delicious, however convenient, however cheap they are. And we have to go back to basics. We have to learn how to cook with basic produce again. And I know it's more time consuming and it can be more expensive. And it's really all that it should be. Why should basic produce be more expensive than these very complicated manufactured products? And the answer is very simple. The companies who make those products bribe our politicians to give them subsidies to enable them to sell their toxic products more cheaply. And our politicians are so grotesquely immoral that they will take that money and leave your children to their tender mercies. That's the first place to start. Right. And it's only after that, I think, that one should start to consider supplements. If you want to consider supplements as hacks or biohacks, and they are, we can neutralize a lot of the damage that is caused by this incredibly toxic environment, this wasteland that the food multinationals have produced for us. You can stop chronic inflammatory stress. And we can do that very effectively with balance oil. So that's one problem and one solution. We can reverse dysbiosis. We can do that very effectively using a time-release blend of prebiotic fibers. And that's what Xenobiotic is designed to do.
Dr. Paul, how old can a child be before we can give them Xenobiotic? What age? Because with balance oil, we know that once they start solids, we can give them balance oil, but Xenobiotic, we're not exactly sure when.
I would say exactly, it's exactly the same thing from the time that they start consuming solids. But you have, obviously, the child is very small, is very low body weight. With the balance oil, it's so many mils per kilogram. With Xenobiotic, we don't have an exact formula, but you would start with very small doses and find out what it is that the child is going to tolerate. It's a really, really important thing to do to get the microbiota right, because that will determine not only the subsequent risk of allergy and autoimmune disease, but a whole range of other conditions as well, including those conditions where we know that neuroinflammation is really, really important. One of the flip sides of looking at this are the reports that we're getting from many different countries now of children who, for whatever reason, did experience neuroinflammatory stress in utero and in the next couple of years after birth, and who went on to develop a neurodevelopmental condition. And what we're finding is that when you give these children an anti-inflammatory supplement and you reverse their dysbiosis, what we're finding is these children are improving so remarkably that in some cases, these children are being designated as cured. And in many other cases, the diagnoses which were made, and very often by experts, have been cancelled. The doctors have said, oh, we must be wrong. This child doesn't have ADD or autism anymore. It's quite remarkable what's happening. And this is one reason why doctors are now working with us in so many countries now, all over the world. So that is a very interesting combination, particularly for children who have neurodevelopmental issues. The problem with type B malnutrition, we can reverse that with Extend, although because that comes in tablets or capsules, that's not easy for children to take. You cannot give tablets to a child that is at risk of choking. I think in practical terms, that probably means probably low to mid-teens. We first do no harm. We don't want to have, problems of this sort occurring. And then when it comes to glycemic mismatch, which is the other major driver of these types of conditions, we do want people to take more exercise. There is the prospect at some point in the near future of putting that into a pill. But I think if we can teach our children the joys of exercise and learn to engage them with a diet which isn't as full of sugars as today's diet is, then their risk of developing metabolic syndrome and those types of health-related issues, and indeed their risk of becoming overweight and obese, is going to be very, very much reduced. So those are the problems. In a nutshell, those are some of the solutions. I'm not saying that solves everything. I think in the long term, I would like to see pressure brought to bear on the food industry to cease their irresponsible marketing of these extremely toxic foods. And it may well be that we'll see a class action lawsuit at some point in the future, quite possibly in the North America somewhere, because people here are extremely litigious, which forces these food companies to pay such a heavy price for selling this kind of crap that they will then take a step back and reformulate. Now, the good news is that given our current and developing understanding of what you do need in your food and what you really don't want, it is now possible to reformulate many of these products in a way which will make them no longer toxic, but actually health promoting. That is now possible. All it requires is a legal or possibly a commercial environment which provides enough inducements, negative and positive, to the food industry to move in that direction.
In your opinion, white flour and sugar, would they be just about as bad as each other? Should we be encouraging kids to eat wholemeal, or, because a lot of kids' breakfast is always a cereal. So sugar and refined carbs would be on the same level?
They're not, to be honest, that different, although depending on the refined carbs and the sugar will tend to give you a high glycemic index. The carbohydrates will give you a high glycemic load. The high glycemic index seems to be a little bit more damaging, and it's probably to do with the rapidity with which the sugar enters the bloodstream and how high it spikes. So I would say cut down on sugars first. And then I think there's a case to be made for moving to helping children to learn to like less sweet foods, the use of sugar substitutes in some cases, and a move away from products made with refined grains to products made with rather less refined grains. So moving from, let's say, from white bread to wholemeal, if it's genuinely wholemeal, would be a step in the right direction.
And which sugar substitutes would you say, there's so many on the market, stevia, erythritol, there's so many. Which ones would you reckon? Because you always hear stories and everybody's a health guru on Instagram. So which sugar substitutes would you, and what's your opinion about honey?
Well, honey is just sugar. I mean, the difference between honey and sugar and high fructose corn syrup, the differences are marginal. They're really not significant. If you want to talk about a non-glycemic sweetener,
safe
there are, sorry?
Safe for children.
Yes. Well, we've had so many non-glycemic sweeteners, and one after one, they've all been picked off by various researchers with different health problems associated with them. And the really interesting thing is that a lot of the research has been funded by the sugar companies. So you really have to ask yourself, well, how good is this research? Are these compounds really so dangerous? There may be some very slight risk associated with some of the sweeteners, but compared to the known risks, which are quite significant, of the very high amounts of sugar that we now eat, I would say that the artificial sweeteners really are a far less worse choice. They're a better choice. Which ones do you go for? I think that in terms of flavor, that is the sweetener which most accurately reproduces the sweetness profile of sugar, would probably be, I think it's called Canderel in the UK. It's Splenda here in the United States. And this is basically a molecule of it's a composite molecule of sucrose, which is sort of rather randomly linked together, but it's non-digestible. And people get all concerned about it and say, oh, nerve gas is involved somehow. That's absolute nonsense. It's a complete misunderstanding of synthetic biochemistry. There's no nerve gas in sucralose whatsoever. It has an effect on the microbiota. Yes, it does, but it probably just acts like a prebiotic fiber. If anything, if it's like any of the other fermentable carbohydrates, it actually increases the numbers of the good bacteria. So I think out of all the sweeteners, that's probably the one that that I would go for if you're going to use a sweetener.
Okay. I'm just reading a question here from Majid. It's worth asking the question about determinal effects of pure honey. Is there anything showing its detriment or impact on glycemic index? Isn't honey a natural, non-refined, processed body healer?
No, not really. I mean, the biochemistry of honey is almost identical to that of sugar. They're pretty much the same thing. And
you
even raw
Manuka honey and this and that for immunity, etc.
Okay. Well, now you're talking about some rather special cases, and there's Manuka honey and Melaleuca honey and a couple of other honeys like that, which do have some interesting properties. Probably it's nothing to do with the sugar content at all. It's to do with the polyphenol content.
Okay.
And the high content of polyphenols in some of these honeys undoubtedly do provide certain benefits. They can be antiseptic if applied topically. They can have some anti-inflammatory benefits if consumed in moderation, because you don't want to be swallowing spoonfuls of Manuka honey, because it's still lots of sugar, no matter which way you cut it. Yeah, honey might be natural, but so is sugar cane. And raw sugar cane is not really a health food either.
Yeah, okay. Another question is xenobiotic okay to be used with people that have SIBO? A lot of kids take probiotics. What do you think about that?
SIBO is a contraindication. If you have SIBO, you do not take xenobiotic. In fact, you're probably going to be on something like the FODMAP diet, which specifically precludes the fibers that we put into xenobiotic.
Okay.
Why is it that so many more people have SIBO? Not too many kids, but certainly more increasing numbers of adults, probably because they have dysbiosis, which leads to chronic inflammatory stress inside the large intestine and subsequently scarring and degradation of the ileocecal valve, allowing the retrograde transport of colonic microbes into the small intestine. Now you have a problem. Best thing to do would be to flush them out of the small intestine, which we routinely do using the carrot soup cure. And after they've gone, you can then use xenobiotic, and it's not a problem. Okay. As for probiotics, the evidence that they work, sadly, is very, very poor. One reason for that is because there are so many different strains and so many different companies are using different strains. They produce different types of results, many of them not particularly reproducible. Another problem, which is endemic to all of them, is the fact that you're not capable, you cannot give very many. I mean, even although the capsule might say so many trillion colony-forming units or CFUs, that is a minuscule number compared with the other bacteria that these probiotic species will encounter when they get into the large intestine. And if you're not co-ingesting prebiotic fiber, these good bacteria will have nothing to live on, nothing to eat, nothing to consume. They can't operate, and they will just be flushed out of the system. There is one product that I rather like. It's called Simrise, I think, and this is a British development, and it combines probiotic species with prebiotic fibers. It's a rather horrible tasting drink, or it was the last time I tried it, but it seems to be quite effective. I don't think you need it if you're using the right prebiotics.
I've just been asked, what do you think of gummies? Because a lot of kids like that and take that, the probiotic gummies that are available.
Yeah, I think there is little point in those because the payload of probiotic species inside these gummies is really, really small. They're small enough in the more respectable encapsulated forms. The amount of probiotic species in the gummies is negligible.
Okay. Anybody else? Any questions? Put them in the chat, please. And fruit, sweetened fruit, like, kids eating berries and things like that, but the fruits like mangoes and bananas, etc., could they be used to sweeten children's food? If they are used to having something sweet, what's your thoughts on them getting fruit?
Well, they can be, but the sweet compound in many fruits, not all, is fructose. In grapes, it's glucose. And the problem is, large amounts of fructose are probably not a good idea, because fructose, even more than glucose, is very good at triggering intrahepatic lipogenesis. That is the accumulation, the formation and accumulation of fat inside the liver. Now, if the child is physically very active and running around, they can cope with lots of carbs. It's your muscles that use up blood glucose, not so much the liver. It's only when you're physically very inactive that more sugar goes into the liver and you start becoming a fatty liver patient. If the kids are running around and playing football and rugby and swimming and dancing and running or whatever else, then they can get away with eating a diet with a much higher glycemic load. And if at that point you want to sweeten their foods and use fruit juices to do it, that's fine. Having said that, fruit juices are not any longer considered to be very healthy. Another big study has just come out, which has shown that people who get their plant foods in processed and ultra processed forms, such as juices, don't do very well. Again, it's probably a pharmacokinetic issue.
Yeah, there's another question. Aspartame as a sweetener in drinks. Aspartame, yeah.
Aspartame is probably okay unless you have phenylketonuria, or PKU, which is a genetic metabolic disorder. And if you have that, you should not be consuming aspartame at all.
Okay. We have another question. ADHD, spectrum dyslexia, would it be just balanced soil, or balanced soil as well as the xenobiotic? What would you say, Dr. Paul?
It's additive. If you start with balanced soil, you're going to see improvements. If you then add xenobiotic, you're going to see more. In many cases, that's enough. There are a few where there may still be some issues, and then we would routinely add Viva.
Viva along with the balanced soil and the xenobiotic for kids with ADHD and ADD.
Yeah, but most, I think, kids actually don't need that. And I don't want to, throw everything and the kitchen sink at all these poor kids. You give them as little as you can, as little as is needed. I stay with balanced soil and start with balanced soil, and that may well be enough.
Okay. And then they can have Viva if they need it.
Yeah.
Okay. I actually have a really I have a story where a friend of mine, her granddaughter developed Tourette's, and the doctor basically said she's got these tics and itches and all that. And we put her on balanced soil and xenobiotic, and in 3 months her tics went away.
I've heard so many cases like this, and the doctors who just give up and throw their hands in the air, they're so ignorant, because all they know is drugs. And they don't study the literature. They're hopelessly out of date. They're very uninformed. And hopefully, when they see cases like this being helped so much with basic nutritional intervention, hopefully that'll stimulate more of them to ask a few questions and inform themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Any more questions, guys? See 3 more. There are some parents here tonight who have babies during COVID. We are seeing a lot of eczema, skin allergies, and tummy issues. How much of this is down to the sterile environment they were born into at the time?
I mean, this is such a difficult question. Any human environment, there is no human environment which is a sterile environment. Just because you're not socializing as much doesn't mean to say that that child is being brought up in a sterile environment. I think that increased stress, parental stress levels, may be playing into this somehow. What we do know is that during COVID and during the lockdowns in particular, which were a terrible mistake, probably one of the most grotesque public health policy failure that has ever occurred, let alone the mandated vaccines, as they call them, which I think have been an absolute disaster. We know that people were so upset, depressed and anxious, locked up inside their homes, worried about losing employment. We know that there was a huge increase in comfort eating. Comfort, and what that means is a deterioration in nutritional status. And I think that parents were involved in that. I think that the children that were in utero at that time, that were growing up in that environment, were affected by that. And I think that's much more important than this idea of the environmental cleanliness. I don't actually think that that's a thing. I don't think it's real.
Okay. A lot of kids are started with banana as a starter food. Is that a good kind of food to start babies on, or what would you recommend as a, when we're starting to wean them, what would you recommend to start them on?
Could I just preface my remarks by saying right from the get-go, I'm not a pediatrician. Okay. Having said that, banana is a very common sort of starter food, and it seems to be a reasonable.
Okay.
But could I just add to that various whole grains? So, for example, porridges made from whole grains, for example, from whole oats, I think are a pretty good thing to start with as well. And you can combine them with bananas to get that little bit of sweetness. And I'm starting to feel hungry.
For topical steroid withdrawals, the 6-year-old child has put on a raft of supplements which did help, but now taking them away and moving to Zinzino, balance oil, and tiny amounts of gut powder. Any other advice for products?
No, not necessarily. It's very hard to make specific recommendations without knowing the full details of that specific case. I would say if you're tapering off and putting this child onto balance oil, you won't see the impact of balance oil right away. It will take a while to build and become evident. I'm sure you know the story. It's going to take about 120 days to reconfigure the fatty acids in someone's cell membranes. Depending on what the score was to begin with, if it was spectacularly high, 6-to-3 ratio, we will very often see improvements very quickly, sometimes even within the first week. If it wasn't as high, then the improvements tend to take longer to materialize. When we say 120 days, I won't say it's the worst case, but that's not, we would expect to see changes before that in many cases, but it's very difficult to predict exactly when that switch is going to flip and when you're going to notice that big change.
Okay, somebody's asking you to comment on this statement that was made by AMA. Traditional medical models have discounted the importance of nutrition in health and in the prevention and management of a variety of health conditions, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and obesity. Recent overwhelming evidence has led to increased attention to nutrition as a core element of health equity and health care, the American Medical Association.
Well, I'm aware of that statement, and of course I welcome it, but really the evidence base that was necessary to support such a statement was were available 20 years ago. The AMA have dug their heels in. They've been dragged screaming and kicking. They've been forced to make that statement because the evidence is so, first of all, there's so much of it. Now, we had enough 20 years ago, we have even more now. But secondly, the reason why they've been forced into making that statement is of the extensive and ongoing failure of the crisis management post hoc reactive medical model. It has been such a waste of time and money. It has been so ineffective and so cost ineffective that even the AMA, which is hugely influenced by the pharmaceutical money, has been forced to concede it. It's too little and too late, but at least it's something.
Okay, we have somebody with a 5-year-old child who's constantly waking up with night terrors. So would xenobiotic balance oil help with that, reprogramming the microbiome?
Oh, Lord. I don't know. I haven't heard that particular question before. I mean, all I can say is try it. And then if the child does respond, please let me know. I'd like to know.
So Marjit has just said, I would like I would just like Dr. Paul Clayton know that he is a symbol of health, and not just for his passionate knowledge, but because he looks younger and healthier than most of my 40, 50-year-old friends who are mainly ex-athletes, a breath of fresh air, and deserves every compliment. So there you go. Paul, a nice
very
compliment for
kind,
you.
but you see, I've got the camera angle and the lighting.
I don't think it's that.
And I don't use makeup, so I haven't had that advantage. But I mean, in real life, I look like 120. I will say one thing, though. I will say one thing. I'm pretty ancient now. I was born in 1950, and I don't take any medication. My blood pressure is 115/65. My resting heart rate is 52. I can run 100 meters or 100 yards about the same speed as I could when I left university. Having said that, I was a terrible runner, and I still am. But it's very clear that a lot of the phenomenology of aging that we've come to accept as being normal are nothing, nor they're not normal at all. And that there is a choice between, for many of us, between healthy aging, and unhealthy accelerated aging. And the choice, which one of those tracks you want to pursue is now available, and it's up to you. I'm not so concerned with people of my age. We've lived our lives. I really am much more concerned with young children, the children who are in the world now and who are entering the world. I think we owe them a duty of care, which we are manifestly at the moment failing to do. We have to bring the medical profession into line. We have to bring our disgraceful political system into line, and the food industry into line. I think the good news is that the phoenix can only emerge from the ashes.
That's right.
And I think new systems will begin to emerge when the current systems collapse. And many of them are at the point of collapse now, because they're so cost ineffective, they're so complicated and expensive to run. And thanks to the incredibly irresponsible and stupid decisions by politicians in Washington, Westminster, and Brussels, our economies are in the toilet. They're going downhill rapidly. Our standards of living are falling. We have to find more cost-effective ways, kinder ways of making healthcare available for those who need it. The models that we're currently pursuing are far less expensive, and they're far kinder, they're far less toxic and dangerous than the pharmaceutically dominated model that we have suffered under for so long. So change is coming, not just because we've been promoting it, but because the existing systems are reaching the point of failure.
Yeah. We have a question here. My child cries most nights with pains in his legs, mainly knees. Would this help?
Well, I'd like to know a little bit more about this case. The pains, how old is the child?
Can someone say whoever?
5. Is that it? Is this from Chantel?
Yes.
Okay, so the child is 5 and has knee pain. Good Lord. I mean, that's unusual. I mean, there are several possible causes. It's unlikely that it's an arthritis. If the child is doing a lot of athletics, it could be, I think it's Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which is where you start getting problems with the cartilage in the knees, which I actually had myself because I was a very keen runner, not a good one, but a very keen one from an early age. People sort of refer to it in a rather uncritical way as growing pains. Whatever, he screams in agony, and doctors
have done scans. There's no arthritis.
Well, I wouldn't expect to see arthritis in a child at that age. I really wouldn't. But even if there's no arthritis, I would, and the pain is that severe, I mean, it might be some kind of inflammatory disorder. And if it is, then balance oil should help to alleviate it. If balance oil doesn't have an effect, that's actually telling us that it is not primarily inflammatory. And we would then have to start moving towards a differential kind of diagnosis. We need more information.
Okay. And then there's a child with developmental difficulties. Would they give him an increased dose of balance oil?
No.
Okay.
Normal dose.
Normal.
And again, I'd need to know a little bit more about the developmental difficulties, the age, what exactly the problems are. I have, again, let me be full disclosure. What we are doing is extremely effective in many cases because we're undoing the damage that the current model of food production creates. We're putting back into the food system and into your metabolism and diet what the industry has taken out. And we're putting your metabolism in a time machine. We're sending it back 50 or 100 years in time to a period when ultra-processed foods hadn't been invented, and we were relying on much more basic foodstuffs, and we were healthier as a result. But there are conditions which are beyond our reach. The tools that we use are in general not very helpful in dealing with genetic metabolic problems, genetic disorders. We generally cannot reach those, although there are one or two exceptions. And of course, there are other problems where children might manifest with issues which are not, which it may appear to be physical, but they may actually be psychological in origin. So there's not necessarily, it's not necessarily the case that we're going to be able to help very much there either. So we can help in many cases, but not all.
Okay, so is there any research on balanced soil replacing blood thinners like aspirin in adults and children?
This is such a dangerous question, and I have to be very careful how I answer it. We have a really an important duty of care to all the people that we work with, partners and customers alike, and to suggest to them that they should stop taking blood thinners if they have been recommended or prescribed, and they've been prescribed for, in general, for extremely good reasons. It would be highly irresponsible for us to say, well, you don't need those anymore, balanced oil will do. Does balanced oil have a blood thinning effect? Yes, but it's relatively slight. I would want to be a little bit more specific, and I'd want to know, well, why exactly were you prescribed blood thinners? Is this because you have, for example, atrial fibrillation, which is one common cause? Or do you have other cardiovascular risk factors? In some cases, you would be able to get rid of the blood thinners and move on to balanced oil. In other cases, you would not. And this is not the kind of forum, an open forum, where I think we're going to be able to get into the fine details, into the fine print. So I'll just say it's a complex question, but in general, we should be cautious. Having said that, there is one thing we can say. If the blood thinners that you're using are the old-fashioned kind, such as warfarin and coumarin, when you take those, you're going to have your blood tested once every 7 to 10 days or so. You're looking at blood clotting time, or an INR time as it's known. And if you are taking that kind of blood thinner and your blood is being tested, if you start taking balanced oil, then the clotting time will start to stretch out a little bit. And at that point, the doctor or the phlebotomist or the hematologist who's doing the testing is going to make appropriate changes to the dosage. They'll start cutting down on the dose of the anticoagulant, and it may get to the point where they'll say, you don't need anything. So the doctor will then make that decision as to whether you can come off the blood thinners. Some of the newer blood thinners do not require this kind of testing, and there, if you were to start taking balanced oil, how would we know if your blood is starting to get too thin? Well, if you start developing spontaneous bruising on the trunk or the arms or legs, if you start to see spontaneous bruising, you've gone too far. Start rowing back on the balanced oil.
Okay, and then there's a lot of kids on Ritalin these days. Would balanced oil replace Ritalin?
I don't wish to be prescriptive, but I'm hearing of many cases where this has in fact occurred. Yes.
Okay. And do you think a natural whole food plant-based diet is better for preventing illness and increasing longevity?
No, I think humans are omnivores. If you look at our dentition, our gastrointestinal tract, our biochemistry, it's pretty clear we were designed to be able to run on mixed fuel. And I think that a plant-heavy diet is good. But many of the healthiest diets, the Viking diet, the Mediterranean diet, the Okinawan diet, they're plant dominated, but there are meats and fish and dairy in small amounts.
Okay. I think I've got all the questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. That was amazing and so enlightening. And definitely we do feel hopeful, all of us, at the end of that. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time and being with us today.
No, you're very, very welcome. I am absolutely committed to doing this. I'm sick and tired of seeing so many people who are aging far more quickly than they need to, becoming ill when there was really no need for them to become ill. Such a loss of human life and time and talent. I take all that very personally. I find it quite obscene, actually, that we have drifted into this situation where our public health has become so bad. And I'm absolutely committed to continuing to militate against that in any way that I can.
Well, we thank you for all the work you're doing, and the stuff that you've made has helped so many people, and you've definitely changed my life. I'm pain-free now, and it's definitely been life-changing for me.
But were you pain-free before? I don't know you.
I
don't
suffer
know
from
your.
osteoarthritis, and
Oh, right.
I was managing it, and
Right.
I'm pain-free, 100% pain-free.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I mean, that describes my own history as well.
So that's great. Thank you so much.